Earl, you have been with the museum for how long?
About the year 2000, but my sister started it in 1991. They initiated the establishment of the museum in about 91.
The original museum was in the Anderson cabin.
Yes, you did your research. You're right.
How was it at the time? The cabin is smaller.
Yes, it was very small, and it was mainly small antiques put in there, lamps, some cooking utensils, wood stove, a bathtub that converts to a table when you're not using it as a bathtub, and things like that. We've really expanded it now. We're 8 buildings, and we're adding the ninth this year,
The museum is open between.
May and September. It closes after the long weekend in September and opens the May long weekend. And the week after we close, we have what we call Pioneer Days, which celebrates any families that homesteaded here 100 years ago. So this year would be if they homesteaded in 1925.
Can we talk a little bit about the Trunell log home?
Yes, it was first started by John Trunell in 1912 when he homesteaded just north of Caroline, mile and a half north. And it was built onto a couple times by him, and it was the first house that had running water and a flush toilet in the area. It's a two-story.
You also have a school which you brought here to this location from Big Bend.
Yes, about 25 miles east of here. We were looking for more of a local school, but we couldn't find one that was available. That one was donated along with the money to move it, which was really good from the community there. One of the people that initiated that school to be moved actually went to school in Caroline, so there was a connection.
Were you born in Caroline?
I sure was, yeah. My dad homesteaded here in 1920.
From where?
He emigrated from North Dakota.
I noticed that quite a few Americans homesteaded here.
You're absolutely right. This area probably was 80% American homesteaders. If you went a little farther east, it was Danish. And if you went a little north of there, it was the Finnish and Icelanders in there too. But this area was predominantly American. First homesteaders here, though, were in Caroline area, were actually Danes, not Americans. That was 1905. But after that, boy, there wasn't very many. Most of them were American.
So let's talk about the contribution of the American homesteaders to this area.
The Americans, for whatever reason, I think the reason they actually came here was it was homestead land, and for $10 you got a quarter section of land. Part of this story comes from my father. They couldn't get land in wherever they were in North Dakota. There was quite a few from South Dakota. There was some from Wisconsin here, some from Michigan, Montana, several from Montana area. They couldn't get land for that for $10 a quarter down there. There's still most of the families, the American families, I still have relatives here, whether they're great grandchildren, grandchildren. I'm probably the last that's only the second generation, but they did contribute a lot to the community. We did have some come into the area too from the East Coast, from PEI and Nova Scotia, but very few.
How was life at the time?
It was tough. The village of Caroline was named after the first white girl in the area, and she was about 6 years old, I believe, 7 years old, when her family emigrated from South Dakota here. And It was all log shacks. There was that was 1908. There was nothing here. There was some living in dugouts with a roof over top of them. It was tough. I'll give you an example. And my dad came in 1920. Most of them come between 1908 and 1913. The war years, there was very little emigration into the area for whatever reason. They were all fighting in the war or what, the young man at the time. But when Dad came, it took him 6 weeks with a team and wagon. There was 4 wagons. Took him 6 weeks from Dunseith, North Dakota to Bazzano, Alberta, and he ran out of money. He worked on a threshing crew in Bazzano, got enough money, took the train to Innisfail and walked from Innisfail to Caroline, which is 45 miles, to view the homestead he was going to file on and walk back the next day. Some of the ones that preceded him probably were as tough or tougher than that.
He came here, and what did he do? He started to build a house right away?
He filed on his homestead in October of 1920. He built what he calls his shack, or called his shack, in November of 1920. And he filed on his homestead, as I said, in October. You had to file on it in Innisfail at the time. And he cleared some land that fall and then left. He actually went to Winnipeg and worked for the winter and then came back in the spring to clear more land.
When you came along, how was your life? Was it easier?
Oh, mine was a piece of cake compared to my mother and father. My dad was 52 when I was born, so I was kind of a afterthought a bit. Dad, when he retired, was farming about 1,500 acres. He was quite successful. He was also a counselor for the village of Caroline, and he was a counselor in the rural municipality at one time as well.
Now you are a counselor.
I was.
You were.
13 years, yeah. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was good.
If your father was around, what would he say?
I think he'd be quite pleased. He was always very forward looking. He was a bit of a gambler on every project or thing he did. He wanted progression. My dad and I and one brother-in-law bought a store in Caroline in 1971. And actually, that was the second time. Dad owned it in the 40s and 50s as well. And then we bought it back. But he wanted progression because even in his farming, he was very progressive. I'd say he was ahead of his time, I think, in a lot of his farming methods.
This museum is actually really more like a complex of buildings and
yes,
a lot of trails.
Yes, we've got a trail through it's a wooded area. It's about not quite a half a mile long. And we try to upkeep it. It's a little tough because it's a soft ground area. We have to keep building the trail up, but it's good. We get help from the county here to do that, and we get help from the county to maintain the museum and grounds and our operating costs.
This is a volunteer-run museum.
Absolutely. We have 2 part-time paid employees, and both of them are part-time. One is a groundskeeper. The other one is a part-time museum attendant. Everything else is done by volunteers. We have about 30 members. We have 4 directors, a secretary, a treasurer, a vice chair, and a chair. Out of that 30, they're all very good volunteers. The trouble with a lot of smaller communities like ours, we're running out of volunteers. We're all aging out, right? And it's tough to get the younger generation enthused about what happened 80 years ago, 100 years ago, but we're trying. I mean, we do have a few younger ones, not very many, but all of our volunteers are quite enthusiastic about the museum.
Let's talk about the events besides Canada Day and Pioneer Day.
We have, and they're not necessarily ours, but they take place on our grounds. We have a couple cancer rides that come through and stop, and they'll set up for a day in our grounds when we're open. Our focus is Canada Day and Pioneer Days, the events that we put on. The rest of them, this year, there will be a small music festival put on at the grounds, likely in July by the looks of it. They've picked a date, I think. I'm not sure the exact date. We don't do anything big. We just rely on people stopping in, and the last few years we did very well in donations from people that have passed away or somebody that had connections to the community that appreciates the museum.
For those who are planning to visit, do you have any recommendations?
In the village, yes, there is, and there's a campground that is attached to the museum grounds. We don't run the campground, the Agricultural Society runs it, but yeah, there's the campground, there's motel in Caroline, there's motels 20 miles on either side as well.
What about the running water? Do you have running water? Do you have generators?
We have electric power, we have running water. The water is only in one building, in the main building, which used to be the two-room school from Caroline. We have running water in it and power. 3 of the other buildings have power. Some of them don't have power because you don't really need it. It's a cost. Yeah, we have wildlife. We had moose through the yard quite often there. Deer. We had some black bear there last fall. They're not that you see them every day, but they are there. You can find their tracks. The bear, we didn't see him. We found his tracks, and there was a local fellow that has a bear dog which tracks bears, and he found several places where the bear had bedded down and stayed just 100 yards from the museum.
The museum consists of artifacts that belong to the people who lived in them, or you receive donations?
We receive donations, but what we try and do is receive ones that are relevant to the area. Like, I'll give you an example. There was an older gentleman who was a cowboy and lived in the area. You know, he donated his saddle and chaps and some trophies he won. That's an example. We've got a wood cook stove that was used by one of the pioneer families. We've got a table that my mother and dad traded for a team of horses in the 1930s. A butter churns. We've got lots of them that were local, one from my mother. Most of our, I'd say 90% of our stuff is related to the Caroline area in one way.
In what way Caroline is distinct, it's distinguishing itself from other areas?
You know, up until the 60s, 70s, Caroline was its own unique self. It was a rough and tumble place. It loggers. The 50s brought in the oil field workers. Before that, it was, from the early 1900s, it was mainly farmers, ranchers, and loggers. Actually, that is still what maintains this area. There's a big logging operation still going on here. There's lots of family farms yet here. Some are getting bigger, but I think it's the people that make Caroline unique and the ones that settled here, in my mind anyways.
A lot of these rural communities are becoming retirement places. Do you have that in Caroline?
Yes, especially not so much right in the village of Caroline, but in the rural areas, absolutely. We're getting lots from Calgary, Red Deer. We've had quite a few in the last 2 or 3 years move from Ontario. Got a couple from Quebec. that I can think of right offhand. Mainly they're buying acreages in the rural areas. And you know what? They're becoming part of the community as well. Give you an example, our museum attendant is from Ontario, but when she come to apply for the job, she knew just about as much about Caroline area as I did because she'd studied up on it and she's very interested in history and does a very good job. Very good job.
How do you see the future of Caroline?
There's still lots of young people in the area, but they're not interested in the history of the area. The ones that are moving in are retirement age or near retirement age. There's a few that have moved in that are working from home via internet or whatever. It's going to be a struggle for a lot of rural communities. I think not just Caroline, but it's going to be a struggle for a lot of rural communities to maintain this. And our board and our members have had that conversation several times. We don't have an answer. I know our rural municipality, Clearwater County, has taken over one museum. I don't know if that's going to be the answer here or not. I hope not. They do a good job with it. Don't get me wrong there, but I would like to see it run by the community. I think it means more to the community if it's run by the community than if it's run by administration at a Rocky Mountain House, the county office, you know.
You are also a member of the Natural Resources Conservation Board.
Yes, I'm an acting panel member, so I sit on hearings for the NRCB. The hearings I sit on are mainly agriculture related, like for feedlots, dairies, chicken barns, hog barns.
What would you say that your major accomplishment for Caroline is?
Personally, if I was to name some, it is the museum and what it's become with those 8 buildings and soon to be 9 buildings. I'll give you an example. We were closed. It was about the end of September, and there was a couple from BC came through town, and we have phone numbers posted if you want to, after hours or when we're closed, if you want a tour, you can phone any of the 3 phone numbers on there and we'll do it. They came through and they were just touring museums. They were from, I think it was Kamloops in BC. They were touring about 16 museums in Alberta. And the compliment they give us is it was very well done. It was neat, tidy, and things had a description because you can lay a tool down and you might not know what it is, but if it says it's a brace and bit, for example, well, you know, and our machinery outside is all named as well, describes what it is, and some of it what it was used for. So I felt really good after they were there, and I'll have to give credit to my wife and a couple of the other ladies. They do a really good job. They're not curators of a museum, but they do a really good job on displays. The key with any small museum is keep it neat and keep it tidy. Don't let dust accumulate. I've been in lots of museums and that turns you off right away.
What exhibits would you recommend to the visitors?
Our main building is probably the best. It's got everything from a mock-up store to a mock-up post office. It has what a kitchen would have looked like in the 1920s and 30s. It's got everything. Our school is good. It's got desks. It's full of desks. And what we did was we took desks from the old wrought iron ones up to the ones in the 1960s. So the kids can come and see what every generation of desk looked like. And one thing I did forget when you asked me about, we bring school kids in once a year, grades 1, 2, and 3, and we spend the day taking them through the museum. They really enjoy it. And we've actually got some feedback from parents that way saying, I didn't even realize this was here. They saw the buildings, but they were never in them, right? So you got to start young with the kids to get them enthused about it.
Some heritage museums, they rent their places for weddings. Do you do that?
Yeah, we do. The church there, that was set up during COVID, so we lost 3 years there, but we've had 2 or 3 weddings there now. It's a small church, like it only will hold 30 people probably. We had actually had one couple from BC who was driving through, and they phoned us afterwards and said, "We want to get married. Can we use the church?" Sure, you can. And it's by donation. If they want to donate something, that's fine. And they do. And they do. And we've had wedding pictures taken there in front of the Trinnell house in the cabin as well. Anniversary pictures, I think, has been taken there as well for some families. Well, the main building with all the small ones, it's heated. It's maintained at no less than 60 degrees at any given time. The ones in the outbuildings, they're covered, and they don't need to be, because they're mainly tools or implements or the desks in the school. And as long as they're out of the elements, they're fine. And the teach reach too, it's not heated at all, but the stuff in there, like the stove, tables, beds, they don't need to be heated or maintained at a certain temperature. I'll tell you a story about this teach reach. Her name was Charlotte Peterson, and she was actually my teacher when she was part of the time when she was living in that teach reach, and it is 8 feet by 12 feet. And she cooked and slept and lived in there with one wood stove for heat. She taught in from the 1930s until the late 1970s. She was 4'9". Her nickname was Hawkeye because she could see what you're doing, even if her back was to you. But she was a good teacher, and she donated that teach reach. It was in her will that she bought it when she quit teaching. She taught in, I think, 5 different schools, and it moved with her every time. When she quit teaching, it was in her will that it would go to the museum in Caroline because that was where she spent most of her time, was in this area. And a neat thing about her was when she passed away in 1992, I think it was, she picked a student from every decade to be a pallbearer. And I happened to be one of them from the 60s. And I thought that was really neat that she'd do that. And I had never thought I was her favorite student by any means, but I must have made an impression somewhere, I guess. You couldn't get a teacher to walk inside one of those now, let alone live in one, I don't think, because there's nothing there. There was linoleum on the floor, but there were wood walls. It was wood ceiling, insulated with sawdust. It was primitive.
You're also a member of the Chamber of Commerce.
Yes, I am. Our chamber is a little unique in Caroline. We want businesses to come, but we want to service the community that are here. Like we sponsor doctors to come here. 40 years ago, there was a doctor in Caroline that come once a week. We've now got doctors here 3 days a week. We actually pay the doctor's mileage to drive out here. The Chamber of Commerce does. We do it to keep people in the community. Otherwise, they're driving 25, 30 miles, 40 miles to a doctor. This way, they have a doctor there. We have a dentist office now, too, as well. We have a drugstore that does very well. And that's what the Chamber is focused on mainly, is how to keep people in the community. Caroline has a Stampede Rodeo, the May Long weekend every year. It brings in 2,000 or 3,000 people. We have a parade in Caroline that the Chamber sponsors. This is one thing I forgot. The Chamber sponsors the parade in Caroline. on the May long weekend before the rodeo starts. It's about 45 minutes long, the parade. Last year we had over 3,000 people lined up to watch the parade, which is great for a village of 500 in the surrounding area, 3,500. To get 3,000 people in town to watch the parade, that's great. And we have lots of community support for the parade. And usually the themes of the parade are, well, they can be anything, they can be anywhere from, we had a salute to the pioneers. There can be multiple things. There can be some cowboy that's from the area here that's being saluted, or Kurt Browning, the figure skater at one time, because the arena in Caroline's named after him. Kurt Browning, four-time world champion, born and raised in Caroline and took his training in Caroline for figure skating. He was four-time world champion and junior world champion as well. The funny part, or maybe not funny, but his dad was a guide and outfitter and hunter. And you would never think a kid coming from that background would end up as a world champion figure skater. But he did, and the arena in Caroline is named after him, Kurt Browning Arena.